I am so excited to share the final episode of Season 1 of the Idealcast with you. We'll be back again after the holidays with Season 2, continuing our learning journey with more great interviews. You're listening to the Idealcast with Gene Kim, brought to you by IT Revolution. I've known of Jeffrey Fredrick's work for over a decade. First, through the groundbreaking work that he did with cruise control back in 2005, which was my first experience with continuous integration, or CI. Although I will admit that back then, I had only the most superficial understanding of what CI was and just how important it really is. He helped pioneer the use of CI, both through cruise control and as co-organizer of the Continuous Integration and Testing Conference, or KitCon. So much of this was informed by his experiences as head of engineering, head of product management, and evangelizing these important concepts. I'm delighted that I've had a chance to get to know him better because he's a co-author of the fabulous book Agile Conversations, along with Douglas Squirrel, and within the DevOps Enterprise community. We were introduced by Elizabeth Hendrickson, who was in the second episode of this podcast. This interview is literally the byproduct of one of those serendipitous conversations that Jeffrey and I had. Jeffrey had made a couple of remarks that jolted my attention. Well, that's actually an understatement. When we were talking, literally everything he said was startling and seemed laden with meaning, which led me to asking him if we could repeat the conversation, but also record it for this podcast. For me, this is a remarkable episode because Jeffrey helped me synthesize and reflect upon some of the major themes from this entire podcast series. I've mentioned that I'm on a quest to understand why organizations behave the way they do, and it was so helpful to talk through some of our respective learnings and reflections. I found so many of his observations to be startling and incredibly insightful. He helped me connect many dots and pointed to new areas that deserve more study. In this episode, we talk more about the nature of knowledge work, which includes software, and how it requires so much more conversation or joint cognitive work, and the challenges that this presents. We talk about what bodies of knowledge are required as we push more decision-making and value creation to the edges of the organization. We revisit the concepts of integration in some very surprising contexts and why it's so much more important now than, say, 50 years ago. We talk about the MIT beer game, Kanban cards, and the applicability of concepts that came up in the second Mike Nygaard episode around generality and information hiding. Why are you happy and are you proud of your work are two very powerful questions, and what they actually reveal about people and the work that they're performing. And why all of this is so important as we try to create organizations that maximize learning for everyone. And we talk about the work of Dr. Thomas Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolution and how it pertains to management models, past, present, and future. Jeffrey, I'm so glad you're on this episode today. So I've introduced you in my words. Can you introduce yourself in your own words?
Thank you, Gene. That was very nice to hear. I've been mostly working these days coaching in organizations. I've been doing executive leadership coaching for the last several years, and I've been more recently doing executive team coaching through offsites to try to work on the language that people use for each other. And the phrase I really like that I came across recently from actually your podcast, Elizabeth Hendrickson described the power of reflecting and adapting to change your organizational working commitments. And that's really been the focus of my work.
And by the way, why do you think conversations are so important?
The conversations, I think, become a limiting factor of a group of people to learn. And I think learning is the limiting factor for an organization to succeed, to adapt and thrive. That's where I've gotten to over time. This is not all where I started. My whole career, I've been very, very interested in reducing suffering in software development through becoming better. And initially, I had a very strong tool focused. You mentioned the work on cruise control. I was super excited about that. I actually had done a startup company starting in 1999 that I can now describe to people as, when they say, well, what's it about? It was a company called Open Avenue. It's like, well, it was like GitHub, but it was before Git. And so we had the right idea. It turns out being early is like being wrong. I would say actually starting a software company in 1999, right before the dot-com crash was really our downfall. But I was excited about that because I could see the struggles that people had in developing software. And the sort of human pain of it was always very visible to me. My first job at university had been at Borland, which was a tools company. The old-time developers will know. Often I mention this, people are, very excited, Turbo Pascal or Turbo C or, Borland C++ or something, often their first language or first serious language. And it was a very interesting company, but it also had a culture of a lot of times of late nights and the sort of classic problems of software development. And I just always felt that there had to be a better way. And I have been looking for it really since then, from the early 90s, believing there had to be a way that didn't require as much suffering. And that's what led me first into tooling, and both the startup that we did, and then after that, cruise control, because I knew viscerally that fast feedback would allow people to avoid a lot of problems that were otherwise problematic. I didn't want people, their success measured by the pizza box count. I wanted people to go home and see their kids on the weekends and things like that. And so that's what really drove me. It was only later, kind of through the 2000s, as Agile was really being fleshed out by the early adopters. And I was so excited. It's so much better. And I really expected it to just change everything. Which it has, but I expected much more change much faster than happened, and I was left with this puzzle. What's going on here? Why? I had always heard the phrase that the future is already here; it's just not evenly distributed, and I could see that playing out from before my eyes. But why? And so that I followed this process from this evolution from tools to processes, and from processes to people. Which I think is a classic one, to really come down to, it really comes down to the interactions between people are what are actually blocking improvement on the ground. In a given organization, if you're not improving, why is it? And it's going to come down to the dynamics between the people. And that's so interesting to me because it's so much generally under our control. People have much more ability to change their interactions with each other than they ever consider doing. It's just easy for people to walk in and accept the dynamics that are happening, to just slot into, I guess these are the meetings we have. Why? Because they're on the calendar. Are they working? Well, who knows? But they're the ones we have. And I'm just excited by the possibility to do more and different and better. Anyway, this is a very long answer to what drives me.
So in your book, Agile Conversation, which I think is dazzling, and one of the neatest parts of it are the citations and endnotes and the corpus of literature that you're citing. For example, whether it's Dr. Chris Argyris, the book Crucial Conversations, Patrick Lencioni, Dr. Alistair Cockburn. I think you referenced the negotiation project at the Harvard Business School.
Yeah, that's right.
I had two reactions. One is, it's a very curious literature to be citing in a book about technology leadership. Yes. And yet, on the other hand, it does seem, I wouldn't say obvious, but kind of in the knowledge business and knowledge work, it does involve more about people interactions. Can you crystallize why you think conversations are more important now than it was, say, 100 years ago?
Oh, wow. That's interesting. I think that the immediate answer that comes to mind was actually twofold. One is, I think that we tend to interact with a lot more different people coordinating the work differently, and there's a lot more variability. That need to frequently adjust requires more conversation. One of the blogs I've been reading is by a historian. It's called ACOUP.blog, ACOUP.blog. And he recently talked about farming in the ancient world. And he was describing sort of how most people lived. They were subsistence farmers growing wheat or rice. He mostly focused on wheat because that's his area of specialty. And he talked about the knowledge that people would develop in their local context over centuries. And the thing about that is you could expect that while there was a lot of variability from year to year, from season to season, a lot of knowledge you needed to have, it didn't have the same range of possible outputs of your existence. That people didn't have as many choices about what they were going to do and what they were going to do together. I mean, you had to go grow that food and then store it and then eat it to not die. Your options were kind of constrained. And that's just not true for us, either as individuals, but even when we come together on our teams and our projects. Like, what are we going to make today? Like, there's a huge range of what we might work on within the same company. The same team has a lot more choices about what to work on, what the outcome is going to be, what will make this year successful than you had 100 years ago. So I think that's that need for collaboration and coordination makes conversations much more an essential skill.
It's interesting. And by the way, I'm thinking about the book Patrick Lencioni. That was the executive team.
Yep.
Right. So that was kind of the point of which integration happened, was at the very top, right? Kind of around strategy interaction, and then kind of that got pushed down. It seems like there's something about the work we do where the point of integration happens at a very low level. It happens everywhere. So the increase in specialization of knowledge, the integration happens multiple times a day.
Yes.
And, through every interaction. Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. But to be clear, that's true. It happens at a much lower level when it's done well. I mean, the one of the lessons of the book, right? The apex of the pyramid, the top dysfunction is inattention to group results. So when the executives start focusing on their functional areas, and like, well, I don't know about those people from marketing, but we're going to have a great technology organization. Or I don't know what's up with technology, but over in finance, we're going to kill it. Like, and when they don't look at the group results, they just start focusing on their areas of control. Then you have this ultimate dysfunction. When it's done well, you have alignment across the business, and that is what allows you to push the coordination down to a lower level. And so you can have that integration cross-functionally at a low level. That's success. But when you have to do that, sort of go up 3 levels and then go horizontally over to the other executive and come back down, well, then you know what? Those conversations aren't happening daily. It's like, well, when is our executive going to talk to your executive? Okay, we might get an answer next week. It's just so when it's done well, we have the opportunity, and I think that's what it comes down to. We have the opportunity for more frequent consequential integration conversations at a lower level than we did before. The cost is system complexity, right? We are in a much more complex system that gives us a lot more flexibility for what we generate, but it's going to rely on those low-level integration conversations to make it happen.
Gene here. I had a bit of an aha moment right here, and it was around the word integration, which is strange since I've used this word a lot in this podcast, especially with Dr. Stephen Spear. The dictionary defines to integrate as combining one thing with another so that they become a whole. I've heard Steve take this even further. We want to combine things with another so that they become much greater than the sum of their parts. It's funny that upon listening to this for the third time, the word integration suddenly takes on a new meaning for me. So Jeffrey helped bring continuous integration to the masses through cruise control. Continuous integration is about creating continuous code builds, continuous integration of code commits from different teams, and continuous testing to make sure everything still worked together when you combine them. This resulted in the opposite condition of what was all too common back then and still too common even now, that integrating code from multiple teams would often take months or even years. Jeffrey mentions later in this interview that many projects didn't even make it out of integration because, quote, integration is where projects went to die. In the famous book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni, suddenly seems like a very similar concept, not about integration of code, but integration of objectives and teams. The main characters in that book is the new CEO who is attempting to understand why all her top executives didn't trust each other and exploring what was required to get them to all be working towards a common objective. In this book, there is very infrequent integration of something, of strategy, of execution, of a shared consciousness, or creation of shared goals. This resulted in very poor performance. They were losing in the marketplace. There was rampant finger pointing and a sense of lack of accountability, and conflicts within the organization had to escalate to the highest levels of the organization. That failure to integrate shared goals at the highest levels made integration at the lower levels impossible, which was why it was so problematic when people had to work together from different silos. Because of the absence of shared goals, in order to make a decision, they had to escalate it all the way up to the highest levels. The notion of shared goals at the top being a prerequisite or a precondition of being able to push integration lower into the organization, I guess now seems obvious. And a corollary is that any integration that was happening in the before scenario of 5 dysfunctional team was only happening within each executive silo. I'm immediately reminded of how in a previous episode, Dr. Stephen Spear described how the level of which integration occurs within military branches has continued to get pushed down over the last 100 years. And that integration in healthcare organization now has to happen between scores of different specialties. In his DevOps Enterprise Summit talk at Vegas Virtual 2 weeks ago, he talked about how in healthcare organizations that he's worked with, because of the lack of any structure that allows integration between, say, nursing and pharmacy at the local levels, means escalating most issues all the way up to the healthcare system CEO. And as he said in his talk, the CEO has bigger problems to deal with than, say, the number of Advil tablets that should arrive at a patient's bedside. Okay, back to the podcast. When I asked Jeffrey, is there an easy answer for why is there a need for better integration at lower levels now, and why is it so urgent, say, compared to even 2 decades ago?
Oh, an easy answer, if I recall, wasn't this Carlota Perez that said we're at the age of information? I think that's kind of the answer. You have this, what we're working with, the material that we are crafting the future with is information. And information is a much more amorphous substance. And it can be molded and shaped in different ways and put to different purposes. And therefore, it leads to more of this sort of coordinated, we need to work together to distill what the meaning of this is that we're talking about. You know, it's that so fundamentally, when you're dealing with something that doesn't exist physically, you know, that you really have to work a lot harder to be clear on what this thing is. If I go and hold up a pen in front of the camera, you know, we're talking about tangible objects, right? Our language can be kind of imprecise because we have like a unit of truth that we can look at, like it's a thing, you know, we can touch it,
right.
we can
you
hand
have
it back
it, I don't.
Exactly,
right?
That's
you
right.
need to send it to me, right? And right.
And so we don't need to articulate as clearly and as precisely when we're dealing with physical, tangible objects. It's because we have the actual thing itself. When we're dealing with pure concepts of information, it puts a lot more work on us to create the language that has the meaning to capture the relevant concepts. And we have to always be negotiating that meaning back and forth between us and finding, because we have no way of directly transmitting our definition to another person, not the real one, right? We can come up with an approximation in words, but it's only an approximation. And then we work out the differences in use through interaction back and forth. We find those edges and differences of meaning over time together. And so, yeah, this is like this ongoing conversation of to define, what does this really mean? What does this really mean?
I had kind of goosebumps when you said that. So let me reflect it back at you and see if it still holds.
Yeah.
So kind of in the previous era, we were dealing with the manipulation of atoms, of matter, and now it's about bits, you know, the information flows. And so even the construction of code is really, I love that phrase, that you create things out of thought stuff.
Yeah.
Right? It's literally infinite possibilities, permutations, and being able to concretize that into things you build. I mean, that's what is so challenging about software. And so it is that ambiguity that forces much higher degree of something.
Yes.
Communicating, specification, conversation, right? That actually makes it, all those things that free us from shipping physical things around is actually what kind of creates this need for higher fidelity communication something.
Yes. When we're doing the work in our own heads, at our own desk, we describe it as knowledge work.
Yeah.
When we start doing it in teams, it becomes something a bit different. Now it's like this conversation work. We're using all of our knowledge together to come up with answers that we didn't have independently. We're generating something that none of us had separately. There's a kind of magic in that.
That is amazing. All right, so I'm going to probably put that in a box for now. We'll probably take it out in a moment. So here's the first question I had prepared for you. So the first startling reaction I had is when I had described that Steven Spears story about the 60 line-side store changes per day. So just for context, this is when he went to Japan with his mentor, Dr. Kent Bowen, with one of the VP manufacturing from one of the big three auto manufacturers. And the story goes, plant manager then discussed how at this particular Toyota plant, they were doing 60 line-side store changes per day. And to which the VP of manufacturing for the big three automotive company said, that's crap. We tried 6 and we ended up shutting down the whole plant for 3 days, right? In other words, it took 3 days for them to be able to recover because parts were in the wrong place and suddenly they couldn't ship cars for 3 days. The kind of the aha moment for me in that particular conversation with Steven Spear was that the Kanban card was the unit of synchronization, and it also allowed for a decoupling of systems so that you could change things at the edges without having to have this all-knowing thing in the center, which actually modeled the Big Three plant, because when they tried to do 6 line-side store changes, they missed something and suddenly parts were in the wrong place. And your reaction to my utter astonishment was, I recognize that. That's information hiding. So can you please explain what did you mean by this and why do you think that's important?
All right. So when you described it and we're describing that pattern, I immediately thought of an interface. What's the point of the interface? It's to hide the information of the implementation behind it. It's exactly this case of I want this to go somewhere, and I don't need to know exactly where. I'm sending a message, and I don't know exactly what they're going to do with it. I don't need to know, and it's that ability to not need to know is what in OO we describe. Well, that's information hiding there. I don't need to know how the rest of the system is going to deal with this. And so you describe this with the Kanban system. Like, yeah, you have that interface. You just redirect it to a different place. The sender didn't need to know where it's going, and the receiver doesn't need to know where it came from, and it's all going to work out. They didn't know. It hit exactly that sort of. I've refactored to that before, so it very much resonated with me.
And so, why do you think that's important in Well, I don't even know how to ask the question. It just seems like a big concept, and I think it's important, but I don't know why.
As I was saying before we started, I was listening to the interview he had with Michael Nygaard, and he was describing about the genericity, architecting for genericity. How do you say that? Genericness, I would say.
Yeah, right.
And it talked about the same property of being able to push a context to the edge. And it was the exact same argument. And in that whole explanation, he was talking about system architecture and about the advantages you get to get the flexibility that you want. And for exactly the same reasons. He made the argument saying, you want the local country managers to be making their local deals. You want what they accept for payment processing to be able to change frequently all the time. And you wouldn't want that to be slowed down by needing to change a service, for example, that was matching up, the types of currency that people would take. So by moving that to the edge, you allowed more flexibility for more rapid change. And that idea of rapid change was what's behind the information hiding. You're making a trade-off in a certain direction to get something you value, which is we're valuing the ability to move things around, to be flexible. And so I think this is why this pattern comes up again and again at completely different contexts in a sense. But it's the same motivation. It's what allows us to adapt. And how much effort do we want to put in empowering adaptation versus control? And this is the trade-off. That what works against this is like, no, you can't do that. There must be a central source of truth. And I think there's a mindset that says it's like to To have anything other than central control is anarchy. There's a great, a friend of mine, Kevin Lawrence, he had a great test, which is you could ask people and say, is it more important that your system be correct or that it be useful? and there's two kinds of people in the world. And it's whether or not they could conceive of a system that's useful but not correct versus the ones who cannot. There are a class of people who say it cannot possibly be useful unless it's correct. And so, and this mindset, I think this is akin to the people who believe there must be a central source of truth. They're going to build in a certain type of system, and whether that's a software program or a enterprise architecture, or whether it's your enterprise organization, how that information flows. This is like a pure sort of bureaucratic mindset. There is one right way, and therefore all the information must flow to and from that source of truth. It's going to be inherently centralized around the right blessed people knowledge system, whatever it is, because anything else could not possibly be useful because it couldn't be correct. That people with real world experience realize that there's value in that. There's value in having a centralized system, bring everything together, but it's a trade-off that you're making. So is it worth it in your context to have that centralization of information before you make changes? Or in your context, do you get benefit from moving things to the edges? And I think that's part of the job of design, is to know when and where to make those trade-offs.
And then maybe to go to the question I asked you before, is there an easy answer to say why that's probably more important now than it was 20 years ago? In other words, pushing it to the edges.
but the very obvious answer is the pace of change. That's it, the immediate slam dunk answer. The pace of change moves what the trade-offs are. When your systems are evolving more rapidly, when you are in a position where you need to be more competitive, where you need to respond to the market faster, it's environmental. If the environment has become more demanding, then you need to be more responsive, and that then makes this trade-off move more towards one direction than the other. It moves more towards adaptability over that centralized, let's make sure we get everything exactly right and the one right way, and the efficiencies that come from one right way. Because there's no free lunch. It's just it can just seem that way if we're getting so many advantages, but there definitely are trade-offs here. So
interesting. Okay, by the way, thank you so much. It's really as good as I hoped it would be. I mean, and enlightening as I hoped it would be. So here's the other thing that you reacted to in a kind of a quick way that again made me halt my tracks. We were talking about the MIT beer game, and when I was describing it to you, in terms of the way it's structured. So you have the retailer, the wholesaler, the distributor, and then the factory, and the very specific one-way flows of the information and the catastrophic outcomes that usually come out of it over 40 years. And you said something that startled me. You said, "Oh, that's obviously a totally screwed up structure," which in many ways summarizes my reaction I formed only after months of studying it. So it seemed evident to you that there was something really, really wrong with the way the game was structured. So what made you say that? And why do you think that realization is important to the work that we do every day?
It's a good question. Again, it's sort of pattern matching going on there. And it's very similar to what we're just describing, which is sort of one-way flow of information, from a central source of truth to the edges, as opposed to optimizing, saying, how can we get information from the edges and inform the system as rapidly as possible? Yeah. This is when we want an adaptive system. That's what we're saying is, how can we know as soon as possible? I was just describing to someone in a coaching call. He was relatively new people manager, but an experienced technology person. And he was saying, how do I make my system resilient, my people system? And I said, well, tell me what kind of problem you're trying to solve. And he described a problem they had where some people had been unhappy. And I said, great, well, that's an incident. How do you go and diagnose that? If it was a technology problem, what would you do? because he knows how to do a root cause analysis. He likes that incident analysis. John Oswald would hate me for using root cause, but hopefully
we know what it means.
We'll use it as shorthand for
Yeah.
blameless postmortem. He actually gives the person I was coaching, he said postmortem. So he likes to go in and I say, look, you have a real advantage here because you're dealing with similar components in information flow. But you have the advantage to be able to ask the components what's going on in a much richer way. And if you were doing a postmortem of a technical incident, you would look back to say, well, what could we have known at the time? What was happening, what was known, and even what could have been known? What could we know in the future? How could we get information earlier to inform our decision and we make better decisions? Because you want to be sensing from the edges and using it to inform what you do sooner. And he was like, oh yeah, of course. And so it really came down in part like asking the people on his team, like, are you happy? Like, because humans are great at sort of synthesizing all the different things that are going on in the projects into like one KPI. Are you happy right now? No, actually, I'm kind of annoyed. Great, tell me about it. I don't know what's going to be behind that, but we're going to learn something. So you can, so in your system design of your team, are you gathering that information from the edges, from the people, and bringing it back? And the beer game, it was clearly not capturing information from the edges. It was not designed that way. It was sort of, we're going to send these messages and hope everything works out, but there's no potential, very limited capacity for learning about what's actually going on, learning about your state and using that to adjust. So it looked to me like you were going to end up in kind of a driven oscillator. You can get these sort of chaotic rhythms from taking like a pendulum and adding a kick to it. And you're going to have this sort of driven oscillation system that's going to be chaotic, just from the design of it.
But by the way, that's a heck of a surmise from very limited. That was an astounding conclusion based on even just a rough description of the simulation. By the way, and I just want to credit you. That's mind blowing to me. And by the way, you bring up something that I've always wondered about, right? And so in the state of DevOps research, right, one of the organizational performance metric is employee net promoter score.
Yeah.
And whether you call it employee engagement, enthusiasm for work. I've always wondered, like, why is that really a marker of organizational performance? And specifically, it's, I think the definition we used for the DORA research was to what extent, what percentage of organizations are exceeding profitability, market share, and productivity goals. And somehow that leads to a sense of, employees being willing to recommend their organization is a great place to work to their friends and colleagues. And so I've never heard such a great definition of that measure. Are you happy? Is the reason why that's important as an indicator is that is a phenomenal synthesis of how I feel about the work I do. Yeah. Right. I mean, can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's, and I'll really like when I do one-on-ones with people, there's two questions I asked, and they're roughly going for the same thing. And the first question is, are you happy? And the second is, are you able to do work that you're proud of? And these things are closely related, but sometimes they can generate slightly different answers. And the reason why these work, so these are important for two reasons. The first one is just, this is a leading indicator. Like, this is number one. Let's just start with this. Employee happiness, an employee ability to be proud of what they're doing, is a leading indicator of problems on your project and problems in your organization. It will show up there before it shows up anywhere else. And now, why is that? And this is the interesting part. And there's two answers. One, we've been saying, okay, well, because we're getting information from the edges. The people doing the work know. But that's only part of the answer, and it's the least important part. Much more important is the fact that they care. This is pure theory Y. And for people who don't know theory X, theory Y, theory X is like old school management. The idea is that employees are lazy, and if they can, they will steal from the company by getting paid and not doing work. And therefore, the job of a manager is to be overseeing them to make sure that they're doing work, because otherwise they won't. And that's like often our sort of caricature of what a boss is, and what a boss does. And it's terribly, terribly wrong. It misses this fundamental insight, which is that no, actually, theory Y, people are self-motivated and they want the project they're on to succeed. They want the work they do to matter. And what makes them very unhappy is the fear that it won't. the idea that the work I do doesn't matter is a terrible one. I remember actually reading Kent Beck's Extreme Programming Explained, the White Book, way back when. And in the epilogue, which is the whole book was mind-blowing to me. The whole book I just absolutely loved. And I got to the epilogue, and he describes that every methodology is based on fear. And the person who designed the methodology designed it to prevent the things that they're afraid of. And what he said is, I'm afraid of doing work that doesn't matter. And I was like, oh, I totally get this. I totally get this. And that's why that was what was so powerful to me about Agile and XP at the time was we were saying, look, we want the business to succeed. There is no tension here. It's not like the business people versus the technical people. The technologists, we want the projects to succeed. We want the business to do well. We want our systems to matter to what comes out of this. That, I think, is a very human element. And once you understand that, once you really grasp that, yeah, people do care, then you suddenly start interacting with them very differently. You see them as a very different source of information. A traditional boss will see themselves as having more information and more knowledge about what's going on. And, oh, there's these people, and it's my job. I'll hear what they have to say, and I'll correct them. And he's missing the possibility that these people are informing you. These people are giving you this fantastic gift about what's actually happening out there. And just from their emotional state, you'll know from the dynamics, like, is this good or bad? And this is a very fractal test, by the way. I was doing a offsite training for some people, virtual offsite on Friday, and I had the people do a discussion. Actually, they were going to choose the discussion topic for the afternoon based on the training. I've been giving them training on conversational techniques. Like, right, you're going to apply it now of how to be transparent and curious. Choose your topic of conversation. It took about 15 minutes from to choose a topic from among 4, and I stopped them. I said, "All right, let's reflect on the conversation you just had to choose your topic. I want you all to write down the things you were thinking and feeling but didn't say in choosing the topic to discuss." And they did that for a couple minutes. And I said, great, I'm going to go around and each of you are going to share one thing from your list that you were thinking or feeling but didn't say. And then I said, we got that all day out. And I said, well, that's really interesting. You're here to practice transparency, but even in the discussion of what to decide, you're not being transparent. And even better, the choice of the 4 topics you were considering, you came up with, that you decided on as a group, was the worst possible choice of the 4. One person passionately cared about one topic, and we are not discussing that. One person definitely did not want to discuss this topic, and everyone was okay. So you chose like the worst possible score for the group because you weren't sharing what you knew, what you were thinking and feeling. And I said, now, having done that, have that conversation again. And they did spend another 10 minutes discussing the topics. They very quickly converged on one. But if you just were watching a video camera, just a recording, it was a different meeting. The first one was terrible. The first 10 minutes, just like, well, what do you want to discuss? Maybe, what does anyone really excited? These sort of questions to the room. And these are all nice people. That's the problem. They're all very nice. And they didn't want to upset one another. And they so much didn't want to upset each other that they didn't share their own actual thoughts about what they cared about because they thought it would inhibit other people. And as a result, they had the classic groupthink of getting a bad outcome. In the second one, they started being willing to share more, disagree more. And every time that someone brought up something that kind of was from a different angle, rather than going along with the flow, it took the conversation in a different direction. It added tremendous value. And you had that just in a few minutes. And the feeling in the discussion was so much better. They were laughing, they were joking. That's what you would have seen on the camera. You would have seen this completely different dynamic from people. And so they were having a lot more fun in that second conversation. They were much happier in that second conversation than they were in the first. So this idea of employee happiness, it's not just like abstract net promoter score over time. It's like right now in this meeting, in this conversation, are you bored? I mean, if you're bored, if we're bored in this meeting, maybe it's the wrong meeting. And one thing they told me is that if you ever are in a meeting and you're saying, I'm feeling kind of bored right now, guess what? You will not be bored any longer. You're about to have a very interesting conversation with people. So anyway, this idea of employee happiness, people care about it, and they care about it at every level, and it's always available for you to be tapping into. How is this going for you? Are you enjoying this or not? Are you bored? Are we engaged right now in this moment with the work we're doing right now?
And by the way, I think that's amazing. And I'm just trying to prove to myself that I really understand why that's important. so, why is that important? So can you connect the dots for like when that happens? Why is the second dynamic so much better than the first? I mean, can you just connect the dots so that you can make the claim this is better for the organization?
Yeah, it's better for the information because it's simple. You're generating more information. At bottom line, that's the answer. You're bringing more information into the conversation. All these things that people were thinking but not saying, that was data. That was information that could have been gone into a decision process, but it was being withheld. Like it wasn't meeting the threshold for contribution. Mm-hmm. So, well, I mean, I'm going to just say generically, do you want to make decisions based on more information or less information? That's kind of the choice.
And does it matter who's making decisions? I mean, is it the person at the top, the decider, right? The hippo, right? I mean, is it or is it more than that?
Well, I like to disentangle the decision-making process, like who decides and how, from the information you're going to use to inform the process. Those are like really, really different. I don't really care in a sense how are you going to make the decision. I mean, you can analyze that separately. It's just not where I usually find the bottleneck. The bottleneck of good decision making is not usually the decision making process. It's what generates the information for the decision. It's that we're not bringing all the information in that we could have, and so that's the problem I'm usually helping people overcome. Because if people aren't speaking up, if they're not sharing what they know, if they're not sharing their thoughts and feelings, their gut feeling, like they're I'm worried about this. I'm afraid of what might happen. Actually, this really excites me. I think this will be great. Like it's not just the facts and figures. They're all their people's knowledge and experience integrated into emotional state is tremendously valuable information. And the more of that you can bring into the process that make visible, the better decision you're going to make, no matter what protocol you use to decide.
That's interesting. And so what's coming to mind is sort of the Kahneman, Tversky kind of model of thinking fast and slow. And if I'm kind of where my head is going is that kind of that feeling is really the, is it mode 1 or mode 2? Whatever system the fast
1.
Part is, right? That's the system 1, right? Is all of that gets integrated into a feeling, right? Maybe informed by system 2. I mean, is that, to what degree do you agree with the correctness of that statement?
But it's interesting. I think that's right, that the system 1 is integrating a lot of information, unconsciously. That division I really like, because system 1 is the part of your thinking that makes most of your decisions. And yet system 2 is what we think of when we think about thinking. So there's this dichotomy that sort of rational, deliberate, effortful system 2 is relatively rare among all the decisions you make. But it's what we think of. And we have this incorrect model of how we make decisions. And we carry that broken model into our meetings. And we think, we're going to think it's all about this effortful analysis and facts and figures. And that's really important, but it's just partially, it's only part of the story.
It's interesting. When you ask, how are you feeling, right? When you ask, are you happy? Are you doing work that you're proud of? It seems like this is when you allow kind of system 2 to work. And the question really says, does system 1 believe it? Right? To what degree is all that data really informing and being reinforced by that feeling? It's like, oh, no, I am proud, right? We're not there yet, but we're going down the right path versus, no, this is crap. Right?
Well, it's interesting. I almost always people answer the question sort of yes or no instantly, effortlessly. And then there's a pause because I don't say anything. And then they start thinking, well, why is that? It's a pattern I see again and again. They say, my little Jabber, I'm like, yeah, I would say I am. Like for example, so there's that recall so it definitely is that sort of element of they know at the tip of their tongue the answer to these questions, but then they don't have access to why exactly. How did I get there? And then it takes some effort to go find it. And of course, remember when talking about thinking fast and slow, this difference between system 1 and system 2 is the source of cognitive bias. So I think it's important to say that when people come out and say, "Oh, I think, what do you think of this plan? Oh, I think it's crap." Like that should not be the end of the conversation. You've gained some valuable information, but not all of it. You're on the beginning of a journey. That the cognitive bias happens if you stop at that point and say, "Oh, I don't need to discuss it any further because it's crap."
And presumably, this is why it's so important to be able to get as much information, right, to inform these decisions. That creates a space for the data to help overcome all these cognitive biases, right? What System 1 is so bad at.
Oh yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. We all have partial information, and information that's much more partial than we are aware of. And getting out all the information, all the different points of view, is where you have the chance to discover surprises, information that you didn't know that you didn't have, and which is the most valuable information you can get. I had a belief about the world. I mean, fundamentally, learning is the detection and correction of error. So it's when I have a model of the world and then some facts come up that disprove my model. I'm like, oh, there's something else going here that I wasn't aware of. Yeah. That was very valuable. Like I have the opportunity to learn. Yeah. And so I want to be sure to grab that. If I don't have people bringing their information up, I don't have that opportunity. And then I'm limiting. This is what come back. We're limiting our ability to learn. We're limiting our ability to innovate. We're limiting our ability to solve problems. And that's how that we're going to be more likely to suffer, which I want to still avoid that suffering part.
And forgive me if I asked this already, but it seems like that too is more important now than it was 20 years ago or 100 years ago. Is there an obvious reason, that easy answer to like why that is?
I think to me, it largely comes back to the same issue, which is that there's more change and therefore there's more at stake in our day-to-day interactions. And that, it may not be obviously follow, but when there's more change, then there's the kind of types of errors are more novel, and we may have less opportunity for recovery, and so that makes it for a more competitive environment. When you have a relatively static society, relatively stable roles that you can expect, what tomorrow is going to be like. You can expect what next month, next year is going to be like. When there's a lot of predictability, then there's less need. I'm tempted to say there's less novel information, but I think that's not actually true. I actually just think there's less need for it. You're in a much less competitive environment, and I think that environmental factor is really important. One thing I've noticed in my career is the pace of adoption of different breakthroughs and the uneven adoption of breakthrough practices and technologies and approaches. And it's you could say it's places that are more competitive, that are under more competitive pressure, evolve faster. They have to. And that's a function of evolution, right? It's not a deliberate thing. It's just the ones that don't evolve rapidly, they die. And so you're left with survivorship bias. Gives you like, oh yeah, that industry has a lot of really advanced people. Why? Because the people not doing that are dead.
In fact, one of the findings in the State of DevOps research in 2019 was actually the first time ever. There was actually the first time there was actually a bias in the vertical, which is in retail. If you're in retail, you're more likely to be a high performer.
Yes,
because of the apocalypse, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's fantastic. This to me, Vistra came home in the other way. In my earliest consulting in the 2000s, I found that the places that seemed to have the lowest pace of change were insurance companies, because their business was just so profitable. They were going to make money no matter what. And I was talking to someone whose brother worked there, and he was describing the challenge of introducing new practices. Was how do you get buy-in to try something new? You say, well, it'll be better. Well, better how? Well, will be done sooner. Anytime you said something would be better, you were taking on unnecessary risk. because no one really cared if your project was going to take a year or 18 months or 2 years. Like, it really didn't matter to the profitability of the company. So if you were going to try to promote something as better, you were saying, well, instead of taking a year, I can get it done in 9 months. Now you're taking a risk. Why would you do that? Who's going to sign off on that? Right? No, it's fine.
Yeah.
Let's just do it the way we know, the way that's safe. So that selection bias that happens through evolution in industries, I think it's much more prevalent now than it was 100 years ago.
Yeah. It's also maybe another reason why it's more important now than 20 years ago or 100 years ago, is that if we are pushing decision making to the edges, the surface area of which decisions are being made, potentially bad decisions are being made, right, is much vaster. Right?
Yep.
So
Yes.
So the quality of decisions, arguably, it's better if that goes up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think that you have this, the interesting thing then about a learning culture like Toyota, reading High Velocity Edge. And you look at the effort that goes into teaching people how to see problems, right? And pushing that ability out to the edge. The effort that goes into making sure that the decisions being made everywhere are being made with the right mindset is something that was so essential. It's not just push decisions out. It's also making sure that people are empowered to actually do something with the ability you're giving them. And that means training them, investing in them, helping them to have the right skills to make those decisions effectively.
Hi, everyone. Gene here. I want to take a moment and thank everyone who took the time to listen to the Idealcast and contributed to the 35,000 listens we've had since it debuted 6 months ago. It's been amazing for me to share with you some of the most compelling lessons I've learned from the most amazing people in the industry. I believe that these lessons are important and can be applied by technology leaders in their own organizations. I and everyone here at IT Revolution look forward to producing Season 2, bringing you even more thought-provoking discussions and lessons in the new year to continue our learning journey. Speaking of continuous learning, the latest IT Revolution DevOps Enterprise Journal, made possible with the support from LaunchDarkly, is now available. The DevOps Enterprise Journal features papers from some of the best thinkers and doers in our space on how they solve their most pressing problems. You can read those papers along with all the IT Revolution titles on their brand new reading app, which is now in the Apple and Google Play app stores. Create your account at myresources.itrevolution.com. So let's get to the third thing that you said that also kind of made me, screech to a halt. So I think this is the first thing I asked you. I had mentioned that we're going through this transition in methods of management, and that was like a Kuhnsian moment, referencing the book Structure of Scientific Revolution.
Yep. Where
anytime you go through a revolution, whether it's Newtonian to Einsteinian, or even before that Copernican to Newtonian, there's it looks like one person sort of had the aha moment, but if you zoom in, there's always a whole school of people, sometimes in competition, sometimes in cooperation. But one person gets the credit: Copernicus, Newton, Einstein. Right? And then Dr. Thomas Kuhn describes it as a sublimation moment. Suddenly, everything sort of crystallizes. We go from gas to air, and then in the moment, right, we're now looking at a solid. And you had mentioned that was triggered some other thoughts for you, right? Can you describe what some of those aha moments were, and why did they strike you as significant?
This is about the change of management over time. I think recently one of probably the book that has kind of helped shape my thinking about that is the book Reengineering Organizations, which introduced, I remember, the TEAL organization to my vocabulary. And one of the elements of that model was that we're getting organizational breakthroughs and that enable new types of organizations. It doesn't mean that all the old ones go away. The old model organization is still there. So you have a red organization, which is the street gang, wolf pack analogy, leadership by the strong. That still exists when you still get the orange, which is, you think of like a centralized bureaucracy, Catholic Church kind of model. Then you have the machine paradigm that comes along after that. And then you have the family model, sort of green organization, much more, we're on this. And then you get to the most newest one was teal. But it describes sort of these different modes of paradigms for an organization, different analogies you could use about how people related to one another. And this idea about the different possibilities, and that when you have a different model of humans and how humans can interrelate, it leads to, it's such a fundamental assumption, it changes everything else. In a less fine-grained term, I mentioned the theory X, theory Y, and theory X would be sort of the poster child for Taylorism style management. When you start thinking that, actually, these people don't need to be, beaten into doing work, they actually can be active contributors in the work. It just changes everything about how you structure your communication, how you structure your organization. Everything else must change as a consequence. And to me, that's the paradigm shift moment, right? That from in that Kuhnian sense, you don't look at the world the same way afterwards. You're looking at them through different eyes. And for people on the other side of that paradigm shift, they can't understand the worldview. It's not accessible to them. It's kind of inconceivable until you have that moment. And then once you've made it, then it's like, I can't believe I ever, how did I ever believe that other thing was right? How couldn't I see it before? And I think that was this idea of this transition of how we manage ourselves, the way we manage organizations, the way we treat people as increasingly active components of the system, as opposed to, pieces, cogs to be moved around.
Right. And then compelled into doing their part.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the act of, it was interesting because Taylor was an industrial engineer by training. And so he's the kind of person so naturally he saw like that engineering model, the organization is a machine, and the person who's designing it and it needs to be diagnosing it. The job of a manager is to be managing all the parts to make sure that none of them are faulty. And if they are, to replace them. These are, essentially interchangeable parts that is being diagnosed by the engineer. That's not how people would, hopefully most people don't, some still do see people that way. They still see their resources in the organization. Can we get 3 more resources on this project as fungible parts? Now, the model we're describing sees people as a source, not as interchangeable, but a source of unique value, that they bring different strengths and weaknesses, and their interactions between them are going to matter in a different way. They're going to generate value that the designer could not have foreseen.
I think it was in Kuhn's book. He talks about, I think, what we Spear would call the dominant architecture, right? Whatever, before the Kuhnsian moment, there was a dominant belief system. Yep. And I think he made the comment that often you have to wait for them to die before the new way, right? Which I think is kind of a depressing claim. As we talk about a new way of working, I mean, is that sort of a preordained conclusion? Is that the only way that can bring this new way of working into being is by waiting for certain people to retire or die?
I think there's an element to which that's true. I relate it to the book Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore, and he brings up the technology adoption life cycle. Right? He introduced the chasm in an existing model. The technology adoption life cycle existed before him. And I think about that technology adoption life cycle in evolutionary psychology terms. Like if you're a tribe, you want people in all of these things. You want some people to be laggards. You want some people who will stick to the old ways and never let them go, because it gives you more resilience in the population. So in a sense, the answer, I mean, yes, there will be organizations, there will be individuals who will never adopt the new paradigm. And we should be thankful because they're holding on to a past solution. What they're holding on to is cultural legacy. That what they're holding on to was a solution to a problem that we had previously not had. We had to invent that solution, and they're essentially the last guardian of that. And it's not bad that they're performing service. It may not be applicable in this case. We may not need that solution in the future, but we don't know. I mean, it's really hard to predict things, especially about the future. And so they're actually, I'd say, in a population sense, they're performing a service. Now, in the moment in my company, that's a real problem. I would like to stop and allow us to move ahead. But so I feel kind of conflicted on this point. So about those individuals, I understand that it's valuable for the population to have them, but they can be an impediment for me as someone who's on the other side of the technology adoption curve. I'm very much in the I just mean new because it's better, and that's enough motivation for me.
So here's something that Steve Spear told me the other day. I thought was equally kind of startling. He said, and it's so novel, I might not be able to repeat it, get right the first time, but he said essentially, for decades, when you get hired into a role, right, your job is to fulfill the obligation and responsibility of that role, and it doesn't change.
Yeah.
Where he said at the Toyota production system, it was never really ever said that you are going into a static system. In fact, the higher you rise in leadership, the more expected it was that your job was to change the system.
Yes.
And I thought that was just a stunning. I mean, I've never heard that before, and it was such a stunningly large thought, right? That your job is to inject change into the system as part of your daily work. Can you react to that?
Yeah. The thought that immediately comes to mind, because you mentioned in Agile Conversations, we talk about Chris Argyris, and we're talking in the book largely about what he did with conversationals, but it was in pursuit of a learning organization. And he introduced something else that people might have heard of before, which is single loop versus double loop learning. And single loop learning is the kind of learning that you do to get better at the job you're currently doing. And double loop learning is when kind of you take a step back and you rethink the strategies you're currently considering. So it's a meta sort of learning. It's a higher order of learning. And so it's not like should we keep doing this the same way, or can we tweak it slightly? It's like, well, why are we doing this at all? It's the kind of thing that says, maybe we should change industries. We ever considered maybe there's a whole different possibility here. And I think that idea that when you have an organization that wants to be resilient, that wants to be adapting, that wants to be learning over time, what are you saying? You have to have that ability to change at higher and higher levels, bigger and bigger changes. If the job of the people in the top is to keep the big picture the same, well, I mean, you're kind of limiting the life of your company. You're limiting the scope of changes you can actually make. So, in a sense, if you want to be long-term successful, long-term profitable, long-term innovative, then it has to be the role of the leadership of the company to be thinking about the biggest possible changes. And to be an ally of change, not an inhibitor of change.
There's some examples in politics where certain leaders can't have the same thought twice, or it leads to a very difficult ability to execute on anything. So certainly part of the job of leadership, is some level of constancy and consistency. How do you reconcile that with that statement? It's a very big statement. Like they have at the highest level of leadership, you have to be open to the largest possible changes.
Right. Well, I think it's one of those cases where you can use the same word to mean very different things. Sometimes people will use leadership as a noun, the people who are in charge of the company. And then you have, leadership, the verb, which is the thing that you're doing. And it's very easy to conflate the two, and they're not the same. I think even when you're describing the leadership that is changing day to day, I think this can come to one of the questions that people have had, and complaints about American companies have been under the shareholder primacy doctrine, that the job of a corporation was to return profits to shareholders, led to incredible short-termism. And some people would say that actually it's impossible to have a long-term innovative public company in the US because the demands of the shareholders to seek short-term returns will prevent long-term resilience, long-term innovation. So I think there's something that is what's the scope of time frame that you're thinking about? what's the time frame and organization timescales that we care about? And at the level of the highest level of leadership should be about organizational design, and you should be talking about, across decades. In my mind, I mean, it's not to say you ignore the problems of day to day, but in a sense, everyone is worried about the day to day problems. They don't have the space to think about the longer term arc and to say, do we have the right culture that's going to sustain us for a long time? What do we need to inject in this culture? Right? What are the values that we have or are missing? What's the spirit we want our company to have? Those are big picture concerns that will matter tremendously for the long-term survivability and relevance of a company. If you're thinking about are we going to hit the quarterly numbers, you might not have space for that.
So, right. Nor the authority.
Nor the authority, exactly. So which is why I think that when you look at places where there has been real innovation, and you kind of say, well, let's look at who has control and why and over what time periods, and what allows them to take longer term views, or what compels them to have shorter term views. And I think you find I've not done a literature research on this, but I think that would be something very interesting to look to. And I would expect that in places where people are more responsive to the stock market, will have a long-term destruction of value, or a stagnation. And places where you have people who are able to take a longer term, then you will have a better longer-term outcomes. Yeah. But that comes to the idea of, like, what's the scope of leadership? What are they allowed? What do they give themselves as their brief to think about? And if they think about long-term versus either short-term move from one thing to the next, or our job is to only preserve the good things that have been handed down from the past. That's the other problem. You can just say, well, my great-grandfather founded this company, and we've run it by the same principles for 80 years, and we're going to continue those principles in the future no matter what. Like, that's not a recipe for success either. You may be taking the long-term view, but you're using the wrong recipe.
I want to bring up a topic that we were talking about before we started recording, and that was around structure and dynamics. I think the goal is to create these very parsimonious concepts, right, which are two, structure and dynamics, right, with maybe additional and dominant architectures, and to be able to, I love that, the parsimonious principle, to explain the most amount of observable phenomena with the fewest number of principles, reveal surprising insights, and confirm deeply held intuitions. And you said something that I think the term you used was it teasing apart, or being able to put certain terms into buckets was actually useful to you. Could you just talk about that in terms of?
Sure. Yeah. I was describing what I've been really enjoying about the Idealcast and going through and listening to these episodes, because it's dealing with an area that I care a huge amount about, which is sort of the system design at different levels. And it was interesting for me that I kind of got my head around the idea of structure and dynamics. That structure is the things that you do, and dynamics are what you emerge, that are what you get. So, and that was really helpful for me. And then within that, then the structure, then we can sort of tease it apart to the different elements. And one of the valuable tests for me was to look at principles that could map from across different kinds of systems. So we have an organizational system, and we might map it into an architectural system. And that tells me that we're on the road of some sort of fundamental insight, some sort of a more generic principle that has some kernel of truth, some atom. There's some very important atom of truth in that. And so, describing the example we mentioned earlier of the Kanban card as information hiding, and relating that physical card to the Michael Neger discussion of something that is, if you just put all the data you need in the transaction, you can now vary it tremendously. Like, oh, so I can get similar principles from my distributed, payment rules and my car production line. Yeah. That there's similar information principles at play. And this idea that they're both governed by the flow of information, and which you think in the information age that might be important. That understanding what we can do to change the flow of information. And how, when we change the flow of information, we get different dynamics. That seems like a really important area of inquiry in the information age, right? We're kind of talking about like the physics of the information age. Like, we should understand this, I think.
Hey, could you just say a little bit more about that? I mean, I again had sort of goosebumps as and I mean, yes, it is very pithy and funny, but also profound. I mean, what do you think is not, if you were to articulate, what is it that is not well understood yet? And that maybe we're kind of on the peripheries of understanding better. What?
Gosh. Well, I would put it this way: we're learning how to see. So
Yeah.
we're in the position at the dawn of the age of microscopy. Where we have the first illustrations of microscopic creatures. We're still developing the tools to see the invisible, to see information and understand it, and see the flows of information and understand it, and to see the effect. I mean, especially as it's mediated by the human brain, which is both a tremendous organ for synthesizing information and hiding it. And I mean that in all facets, both the good and the bad. And so we have this. Are very good at learning when we have feedback on what we do, when we can take an action and see the results. We are not good at learning in situations where we don't get feedback. It's very difficult to develop skill if you don't get feedback. I could go further and say it's impossible to develop skill if you can't see the feedback. I think the Wordley mapping talk that Simon Wordley does, and he describes trying to play chess with and without having a board, is a good analogy. Right? If all you have is the stream of moves and you've never seen a chessboard before, you might eventually learn some way to play chess after a fashion, but you will get crushed by anyone who has a board to see. And what he captures in that analogy is the value of learning to see information in a useful way. And I just think in these sort of system level properties, we're still not good about being able to see and understand and characterize information flows. Now, one of the things I really liked in Accelerate was that introduced me to the idea of the different cultures of being, psychopathic or bureaucratic or generative, and they were categorized on the function of information flow. It was the flow of information that would allow you to tell what kind of organization you were in. That characterization on how information flows was a key insight, because, of course, information flow is going to affect all this other stuff we're talking about: your ability to learn, your ability to execute, your ability to innovate. These are all things about, knowledge work in the information age, bringing experience and information together to get a result.
Holy cow. This is such a stunning conversation. By the way, I've loved the Western organizational typology model. I've never really thought about it as an information flow categorization, but now that you say it, it's obvious. But let me tell you something that has also stunned me. I say this just because I suspect that you'll have just a profound observation that will also blow me away. I'm rereading a book called Command and War by Martin Van Crevel. This is like the third time I've read this book in 25 years, and it's such a dazzling book for me. And essentially, he's kind of says in the history of warfare, there's like four basic phases. You have the Stone Age of command, where everything before Napoleon he would categorize the same way. In general, permanent formations were less than 4,000 people because that was the most you could control visually. The term detachment really meant detach and never come back. You could fork but never join, because once you fork, you'll never see them again until the end of the war, right? Because if you're more than 4 miles apart, you can't even find each other, let alone send messages, right? So that means you fork and you basically have lost control of them. At the speed of information flow was, rumor could travel maybe 200 miles in a day, but reliable communication was basically at the speed of horseback. It could go higher, but it required a lot of fixed infrastructure, like stable roads, like permanent posts. So that meant that information could only travel quickly behind the lines, never on the lines or ahead of the lines.
Yes.
Right? So it meant that, which led to the second age of Napoleon. He would make the claim the majority of an army, a fielded army's existence was basically surviving. It was logistical. In fact, the only time you would split a force is primarily to keep them fed.
Yes.
You needed high population densities.
Yep.
And so it was actually Napoleon who kind of recognized that, population densities had gotten high enough where we could actually have larger forces in the field. He was a phenomenal micromanager, like prodigious. And for the first time, he fielded, I think, 300,000 troops in the field, right? Which was, never seen. So orders of magnitude larger than ever seen before. And he created the command staff, where it was essentially the first time he had senior positions reporting directly to him to help ease with the kind of communication problem.
Mm-hmm.
The next phase was, the mission command in the World War II by the German army, kind of representing what he would view as a pinnacle of decentralized command. And then he had this other example of the Vietnam War, the U.S. forces, where it was a combination of a couple things. One is it was the first time where communication equipment was cheap enough so it could be fielded to, much lower levels in the organization, which led to communication security risks. So you had to put encryption in the field, which meant that they were always saturated. So you had flash traffic, which basically said it was important enough to be encrypted, which was always saturated. So they created super flash traffic, which is for really, really important messages. But then you ended up with this phenomenon where any mistake, in the on the battlefield could be on the evening news. You had this position where a captain on a hill would be micromanaged by a major orbiting in a helicopter, being micromanaged by a colonel in a helicopter above them, being micromanaged by a general in an orbiting 707 with the Joint Chiefs on the satellite phone in the Pentagon, essentially depriving autonomy at a rate that was unprecedented. This too is an information problem.
Yes.
In fact, it was actually called an information problem. And so just like the Toyota bringing that cost change is an information problem, it seems like this too seems profound and important to me. Could you react to that?
So that's really interesting to hear that recapitulate history. And I'd heard that some version of that up until, but not including the Vietnam War part. But I am aware of that sort of phenomenon of people on the ground being, micromanaged from the White House, and that with terrible results. Like it's awful. What's funny is because you could understand, it's an understandable mistake, because whereas before you had a trade-off between sort of centralized communication and local decision making. And you mentioned the German model, which we actually talk about it a little bit in Agile Communications. We took a bit on briefing and back briefing. The name of the book, we got it from escapes me, but it was from that German Prussian military system. We go a little bit further back to von Moltke in there.
Right.
But what you had there was the idea of mission intent being sent out in the knowledge that people were going to have to act independently, that there was no way to have information flow back and forth centrally. So when you suddenly get the technical breakthrough that allows the information flow to be richer, it's the natural mistake is to say, well, great, let's bring all of that back. And we can take the communication pattern we had before, the dominant architecture, and we're going to ramp it up with the new technology. We're going to supercharge it. And that doesn't work. It turns out that breaks in different ways. So I can see why that would happen. And it made me remember of a book, an article that I read many years ago called "How I Learned to Let My Workers Lead," which is one of the first articles I read about self-organized and self-organization within companies. And this is from Johnsonville Sausage Company, I think, something like that.
Johnsonville Sausage. Yeah, right. Right. Which turned into a book.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
So, and when I read that, one of the things that always struck me when he talked about the transformation of the company from traditionally managed to self-organized was they needed to invert the flow of information. What you have to do is you have to take this innovation to have all this connection, but rather than using it to pull all the information from the edges to the center, you need to push it from the center to the edges. Like that was the opposite. He's like, we had to invest a lot in how we pushed all of the information about the company, finances, and management out to be visible to the workers so that they could make informed decisions. It turned out that there had been information hiding again. Like the management had information that wasn't shared widely. Now, in part, you could say, well, because they previously didn't really have a technology in, say, the 40s to go and have everyone know, like, what the current bank balance was and what was today's sales. I mean, management didn't know it. So there's no way that people workers on the line could know today's sales because no one knew it. As the information, and by the time that you did get information, it wasn't relevant to the work the workers were doing. When you start having information coming back to the edges, it turns out the best thing from the edges center is the best thing you can do with it is put it back out to the edges again. Because the fact that you can go and know that there was a sale of those sausages, over in that store over there, like the beer game, right? Think of the beer game. If you could have the people on the line know how many cases of beer were ordered today, that might be really relevant. Right, so that's if you had the Vietnam staff, devising this, you would have had the helicopters getting the information from the stores, and they would be sending the information back out to the stores again. They'd be telling people about where to move the displays around, but not taking it to the people who were actually in the beer factory making the beer. They had the information flowing the wrong way. They were using the information innovation and availability of information flow, the cheaper information flow, and solving the wrong problem.
And so if I hear you correctly, this is a relevant lesson to what we're talking about.
Absolutely. So the old model was about how do we build situational awareness for the center? Right? How does Napoleon get information about what's going on with all of his troops everywhere so that he can micromanage them and decide?
Yes.
The breakthrough post-Napoleon and in the Prussian army is about mission command, and you're going to pull information from the edges to inform strategy. You're going to push the strategic decision down to people so they can implement it, and they're going to be making, but there's still information scarcity. The expectation is that the people on the edges are working with local information, right? They're optimizing. They're doing this work locally with information that they have that no one else has. What we now have the ability to do is to not only enable those people with information that they have locally, but the information globally. They can now have situational awareness of a much broader scale. Of course, what we first did in the Vietnam War problem was to try to say, let's get all the information at the center. But now we're saying, actually, how can the information know? And of course, in the series of podcasts, you have brought this up. The solution to this, right? That was Team of Teams, the Stanley Crystal book. What were they doing there was about bringing information in and pushing it back out. They were making it so that people were able to, the information was able to flow to who need it, and you were able to dynamically get the coordination they needed at the edges, right? Without it having to go through the White House.
Yeah, this is amazing. By the way, he's presenting again in Vegas as he did in London, this time with Jessica Rife, who comes from the software space. And it is so amazing. In fact, there's actually a specific term I asked him to talk about, which is, he said, imagine the feeling when you are, you have the autonomy you need. You can run and shoot where you go because the mission has been architected in a way where you don't have a lot of dependencies, right? All the dependencies are known, right? If you go in this direction, you would find don't go there, right? Because you have interdependencies.
Yes.
But he said there's this phenomenon that happens when, and I love that he has a phrase for this, when the decision space gets pulled up, meaning like someone above you is taking that decision space away from you,
yes.
Right? And how frustrating that can be, right? Especially when it's grounded in the conviction that you actually have better data locally.
Yes.
Yes. And he actually gives a great example of like the White House Situation Room during the Osama bin Laden raid, of where it's a bunch of anxious faces, and it is a one-way communication. They are observing. It's not reaching down, 12 layers of management to tell someone what to do. I just thought that was so interesting. Last question. By the way, I got to tell you, this is so fun.
When you have it pulled up to the wrong level in software, what do we call that? A feature factory. Like, at least that is one complaint. That's one type. There's many ways to repeat that problem. But when I hear people complain about a feature factory, what they're complaining about is that the decision space has been pulled up to the wrong level.
Actually, give me other examples of when that happens.
So
in fact, one is in the Unicorn Project, right? Decisions have to go, get the levels of authority needed to approve a decision get pulled up, right? That's another example. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. We're going to solve these. We're worried, so we're going to solve this by increased control, right? That's the driving characteristics. You look at that is that because we sense risk, we're going to try to centralize the control of what happens. That will have a tendency to pull the decisions up to too high of a level, because you're saying, well, we're going to have a higher level review, and it's not long until that review becomes direction.
Just from a logical rigor perspective, I also want to observe that, like during high consequence situations, like, high outage cost outage, right? That's actually an appropriate place for certain types of, rigidity to come in, right? It's like, okay, no one touch anything, right? We need to isolate, action so that, we can better sense make the world around us, right? I mean, so, there are situations where it does lead to chaos. Right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And we can get into like what are the things that cause that chaos, like unexpected interdependencies, partial information, right? That's absolutely. And so you're going to band-aid over your problems of information flow by slowing down action, because you don't want people acting faster than information can flow.
That's excellent. Okay, the last thing I wanted to get your thought on was this kind of 2x2 matrix that I've been putting together with Steve Spear, and I just thought this was interesting, right? Because the original goal was to kind of tease apart a paper that Dr. Amy Edmondson and Dr. Michael Roberto, they're comparing the culture between the Apollo space program and the space shuttle program.
Yes,
and their words were experimental culture, like on the frontier, everything we know that we don't know enough. So that kind of characterized the space program in the 1960s, leading to the Apollo program. And then they characterized the space shuttle program as a standardized culture, where there was an operating tempo that we had to provide low cost to space. So what kind of resulted in this was this matrix. I think that the tool here is to be able to create a theory of why high performance exists, whether it's the things we've discussed, Apollo space program, Toyota production system, Naval Reactor Corps, Alcoa, and be able to explain why. There's a causal theory that explains high performance, and then also to be able to prove the contrapositive. In the absence of these constructs, high performance cannot exist. So in the graph, it's on the x-axis is the degree of which work is standardized, meaning we write down what we do what we wrote, and then the second one is the degree of which we are integrating feedback into our standardized work.
Yeah.
And so I had touched on this in the NIGARD podcast. Can I get your reaction on that?
Yeah, I really like that. I was also struck by that in part because I remember the question of looking at the principles from Rickover, and like they seemed really anti-agile in some way. And how could so these are two good things, but from seemingly a very different point of view. It's funny because in standardization, you meant one thing you said was what's written down, and we do what's written down. And I think that's actually a trap. I think here that standardization is really important, and the integration of feedback. So I like these axes here, that we need to have integrated feedback and we need standardization. That doesn't mean written down. And because the thought that came to mind there was my early XP teams that I worked on were some of the most disciplined teams I've ever worked on, where we had very clearly made oral contracts of how we were going to work. And we were keeping each other to that daily. And I remember when this was still new to us, and we were still, in this sense, maybe we were a bit experimental. We were learning our way through XP. And I remember sitting with a pair, we were relatively new pairing, and we're talking about what we should do next. And he said, if we were brave, and I'm not saying we should do this, but if we were brave, what we would do is we'd write a test next, because that's what we said we were going to do. And I was like, you're right. Let's do that. And so we were doing things experimentally, following the standards that we had set. we had made a contract with the group that we were trying this out. We were trying extreme programming. And to try it meant we were going to do the practices, not because they were right, but because that's what we were doing. And I'll just say, this has been this discipline of following the form is something that has come back to me again and again over the years. And most recently on this work around conversations, where I will run a conversational dojo. And we'll say, look, this is what we're practicing today. I'm not saying it's right, but this is the form. So we're all going to try to put our conversation in this form, and we'll see what we learn. And it takes real discipline to do that. I think that's the value of this standard work, is that it takes real commitment. It's not natural to follow a standard practice. Alistair Cockburn, who you mentioned in passing earlier, he had one of the most influential papers on me was his paper about characterizing humans as nonlinear first-order components of software development. Very humanistic style. It doesn't sound like it, but it says, yeah, people matter. And what he said was, because people matter so much, we should look at their attributes. We should understand the attributes of people. And one of the key attributes of people is that they are not good at behaving consistently. They do not act consistently over space and time. We should not expect that of them. What you're describing here in the upper right is high discipline systems where people have made a very strong effort to ensure consistency. They're trying to remove one area of accidental error, which is accidental variation. And they're saying, so let's try to remove that through discipline, and whether it's an oral contract with with a pair checking, giving each other courage to follow the process, or whether it's being very rigorous about following the standard process. You're saying, let's limit that sort of variation so that we can have pure learning for what actually happens. We don't want the outcomes, in Deming terms, we want the system under statistical control so that we can improve it. You can't improve a system that's not under statistical control. Mm-hmm. So that's what I think of when I look at this on the upper right, with that high standardized work and high degree of feedback.
Yeah, and by the way, we probably could hear sort of the hedging I was doing, and just maybe even the discomfort of just trying to reconcile. Boy, it doesn't sound very DevOpsy.
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
intuitively, right? I know it has to be true, right? And in fact, if you come, then I think if I heard you right, the trap is writing things down, or the trap is calling them rules. I mean, I think there's a lot of words that immediately take us down, like, no, this doesn't apply to our work.
You get the form. The problem is people get caught up on the form and lose the essence, right? And so they say, well, for example, this is the problem of CMMI level 5. Well, because we wrote it down, we have a good process. Or even to say it's standardized because we wrote it down, right? And it's that doesn't follow those. That's not how logic works. People, it's easy to substitute. This is goal displacement. Right, you have an ultimate goal, and you have an intermediate goal that's on the step towards that goal. So it's like we want to be standardized, where we're always doing the same thing everywhere, so that anywhere there's innovation, we can spread that learning everywhere. So we want that standardization for that reason. Along the path to that, or actually, I'm going to go further. What we want is the learning. What we want is the learning, and to capture and spread the learning everywhere as quickly as possible. How are we going to do that? Standardized work. How are we going to do that? We're going to write it down, right? So we have this multi-step process, but it's so easy to lose sight of the ultimate goal was learning, and instead think it's about the documents, right? Yeah. And this is why you get people doing checkbox OKRs, for example, or checkbox anything. It's like, this is the bureaucratic mindset. We've been told this is the form. Can we check? Yep, we've done the box. We've set the OKRs. Yes, we've scored them. We're done now, because they're not focused on learning, which was the real goal.
Yeah, I'm looking at this matrix, and I'm trying to concretize the information flow problem. I mean, it clearly has to do something with information, right? Yep. Where is the information flows in standardized work and degree of integration and feedback into standardized work? What are the information flows?
Okay, so I think there's two elements here. So when you talk about degree of standardized work, I would say the first thing that you're doing is you're improving signal quality. Because you're taking out noise, you're taking out random variation, you're removing randomness, so that with low signal quality, it's just hard to learn. You can't make sense of the information. So you're improving the quality of information as you improve the standardization of work, right? And then you have the degree of integration of feedback, which is saying, well, how are we getting feedback? Like this is signal, and the other one is, are we using the signal? Like that's you have to do both. It's not enough to generate the information. This is like, how many times have people gone to an outage and you look back and say, well, what was going on in the systems? Oh yeah, look, we have a metric that would told us exactly what was happening, but no one was looking at it. Or we had an alert set and the alert was going off, but no one was monitoring it. The information was there, but the system wasn't set up to use it. That's the left-hand side, the degree of integration of feedback. There's two elements. Is our system generating information? One, and two, are we using the information? And that second one is a lot harder. It is much harder because it works against our habits. Our human nature is to not learn. Our human nature is to find habits and routines and things that are good enough. And it's very hard to be that sort of disciplined, rigorous product, to say, like, to use the phrase from the other podcast, to work out all the funnies, like on the Apollo missions. That's not human nature. And it could contrast that with the space shuttle, right? The foam is coming off. Well, that's a surprise. Seemed to work okay. Carry on, right? Sure. How do we know it's okay to fly when there's foam coming off? Because we've done it before.
Right.
That is more human. I think that's the thing, that the not really driving to learn for things that are not obvious is kind of not a normal human behavior.
Yeah, it's definitely system 2. System, we have to
absolutely
bring system 2 to the foreground.
And the important part about that is that, I always say this: system 1 and system 2 in theory make a great pair, right? System 1 gives you an instinctual reaction, and system 2 is there to back it up. I said, but the problem is that system 1 is biased and system 2 is lazy. And this is what people forget about reading that, is that you're evolved to not use system 2. Everything about the design of your brain is to use system 2 as little as possible. It's not comfortable to multiply three-digit numbers in your head. You can do it, but you don't do it for fun because it's work, and you're evolved to not do it. So this is what we're asking people in the upper right-hand quadrant, to live in that system 2 land all the time. And it takes a lot of structure. It takes a lot of structure to support people, to get them in a space where they can live in system 2, where you can have the dynamic of living in system 2 all the time.
Wow. This is so great. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you one question that will seem so tactical. One thing that occurred to me as you were talking, we were talking about Kent Beck's amazing book, Extreme Programming, and one of the most provocative, startling, preposterous notions he has is pair programming. It just seemed preposterous, right? Like absurd.
Yeah.
Many people tossed out, his notion of Agile just because of it, right? Because it seemed so contrary to common wisdom. And so when you talk about the intangibility of thought stuff, right? And pair programming is exactly what came into my mind, right? In terms of like, just how counterintuitive is it that just having two people work on one problem, arguably leads to better outcomes than two people working separately on their own.
Yeah.
What other sort of insights or revelations came through kind of the Kent Beckian notion of pair programming?
That whole Extreme Programming Explained, and it really distilled a lot of ferment that had been happening in that space. I was fortunate enough to be on Word's wiki, the C2.com wiki in the late 90s. I think I was first there in something like, I want to say 98 or 99, something like that, where you would have people like Kent and Alistair and others and Ward Cunningham and Ron Jefferson, like talking about these ideas. Have you tried this? Have you tried that? What do you think about this? And it was really people wrestling with something very similar to what we're discussing today. Because in part, talking about the lessons from Steven Spear and the Toyota production system and high velocity edge there, it was actually the same material that we were looking at the late 90s. We were looking at Toyota and Honda and what was happening in lean, how manufacturing had changed with lean manufacturing, but it hadn't made it to software yet. And so we were saying, what are the analogies? What are things that we can use? And people looking far afield, Christopher Alexander and The Timeless Way of Building, at looking for, quality without a name, building quality in, all of these elements, and finding counterintuitive insights that we could apply in very practical terms. So you didn't really need to understand the neuropsychology of humans to understand why pair programming worked. You could just do pair programming and go, oh yes, we're actually getting more done. We're writing and committing more code. We're shipping, actually more importantly, we are shipping more code with fewer defects with two people working on one bit than we were before with people working separately. We were changing our metrics and changing what we measured. This is like a paradigm shift, right? Where it moved from, are we delivering our software as code complete, right? Have we hit like software development complete and we're ready for the integration phase, which is where projects went to die because you would enter the 6-week plan integration phase and it would be 6 months or 9 months or never. Like projects would, but because you had this mountain of like, no, actually, that's not the way to be successful. We need to stop looking at software, committed to software that ships to and gets used. Like the usage matters. That changing of the goalposts, that changing the way we saw, it led to all kinds of things. Pair programming was one. I mean, the other thing that really stands out for me was in that book, if something's hard, you should do it more frequently. This was the argument for continuous integration. Integration is difficult. Therefore, we should do it all the time. That is probably the most counterintuitive element, certainly next to pair programming, I think, in that book. And man, the resistance to that. You were talking, we can all talk about sort of, I remember doing the impossible 50 times a day from Timothy Fitz at IMView, about deploying to production 50 times a day. Every commit made it out to production, unless it, assuming that no tests failed, and the testing system that went into it. But in there, it was a question of, did you check in multiple times a day? It was not normal for a developer to check in every day. I think people will forget that. People would have code on their desktop for weeks. And the idea that you're going to check in not just once a day, but multiple times a day. That was another sort of aha moment. In fact, you're going to be integrating all the time. And I remember making a game of it. Like, well, let's taking this dial to 11 and being in a 4-person team with 2 pairs. And we were like racing. We wanted to make integration the other team's job, right? So we would be, what's the smallest test code cycle we can do and commit, so we could look up and sort of, understatedly say, you know what, you're going to want to pull, and then quick, get the next one done. It's such a different dynamic. The first company where I was doing this, we looked at check-in metrics, and there was a 10-fold difference over a 6-month period between the person who checked in the most and the person who checked in the least. Literally 70 times versus 700 times. Massive difference. Now that's not productivity. I'm not saying that the person who checked in 700 times was writing 10 times more code. That's definitely not the case. But they were generating information a lot more frequently. The information flow was utterly different, right? And that's what it comes back to. These insights about pairing and integration are about information flow. They're about opportunities to learn early. The earliest time you could learn is when I'm there talking to the person before I even type. The next person, I type it in, and he goes, wait a minute. You missed a semicolon. It was faster feedback than the compiler. So, these insights were really, they have these different forms, but they come back to what we're talking about. Why were they more effective? Because they generated more information faster. They had tighter feedback loops.
I gotta tell you, my cheeks hurt from smiling so much. I really appreciate this. And by the way, just to reciprocate with the story, at the InView one, but by the time I had read that article, I was sort of immune to the shock of deployment. But I was still shocked when I read that how they did database schema changes, or the fact that like you would, instead of making a schema change, just store it in a different way. In other words, take the complexity in your code, not in the database. And that was shocking. Like that struck me as immoral. Like what sort of psychopath would do that? And yet, given the catastrophic impacts of bad schema changes, I mean, that was clearly an adaptation, right, to work around that. It was just amazing to me. Gene here. Okay, I just want to punctuate that phrase that Jeffrey said. They were generating much more information, and they were generating that information much earlier, which meant that they were learning more and learning earlier. Holy cow, that seems like a super important concept, as well as concretizing all the way that information helps us learn. I also did want to take a moment to describe that famous blog post by Timothy Fitz at IMView called Doing the Impossible 50 Times Per Day. I had mentioned that the shock of headlines like 10 deploys a day had started to wear off on me. It seemed like that was destined to become the new normal, and I was having plenty of fun describing it in my own presentations to shock and horrify the people I was presenting to. But I remember in 2013, Jez Humble showing me that article from Timothy Fitz, and the utter shock when I read it, and to learn what these savages were doing. It wasn't in the blog post, but something in the comments that Jez had pointed me to. Basically, it said that they avoided doing risky database schema changes the way that most people did them, which often resulted in application servers crashing when they looked for database columns that no longer existed. So instead of renaming table columns, they would make a new column, copy all the data into that new column, change all the code to query that new column, and then safely drop the old column. So it really did offend me at first. The notion of having the same data stored in two places and introducing even more complexity into your code was definitely the opposite of the way we were trained to do things in school. But of course, it does make so much more sense. They actually decreased the risk of database schema changes and took advantage that code is much more malleable, shapeable, and testable than the database. Even now, almost 7 years later, I still marvel at how ingenious and counterintuitive and even shocking their practices were. Okay, back to the interview. I have this feeling, what they call it, learning organizations, or there's a body of work that goes back 50, 60 years.
Yep.
I'm thinking about Dr. Aguirre's, all the lean researchers, whether it's MIT Beer Game, organizational dynamics, system dynamics. I mean, I feel like this all part of a cohesive body of work, but my feeling is, and this is maybe the height of arrogance to even claim, is that there's something missing, right?
Okay.
That as we enter the age of software and data, right, at the age of information, there's a cohesive whole that is missing. And that's a very grand claim to make, but I'm just wondering if I can get your reaction on that. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 is utter disdain for that comment. Clearly, I didn't read a certain book that I must go read, and that everything I just said disqualifies me from anything that you care about. 10 is like, oh no, there is something missing, right? As someone who has read so copiously, is there something missing, and you feel like this sort of fills a hole?
Oh, wow. I definitely think something's missing. There's no question, and I'm not sure exactly where. But I mean, I think if you look over the course of time, so yes, there's this body of knowledge, but we're expanding our understanding of the constituent bits very rapidly. At the time that you started, so you're going to go back into the 60s or even early 70s, it was before the Kahneman Tversky stuff, right? Where the cognitive biases. We didn't have the concept of cognitive biases as part of a vocabulary at all until the 70s, and it's not been common in our thought process of organizational design until even is it still common? Are people really designing around cognitive biases right now? I think mostly not. So in our daily thought process of how we manage and design these systems, we're not using the latest knowledge. It's not all been integrated yet into the theory of learning and software, because part of it, you mentioned two very different things. Part of it was humans and human systems, but then you brought in information. And when you bring those together, you're talking about what used to be called cybernetics, right? Which is a term that's way out of fashion. It does not, but it used to be cybernetics systems. Exactly. But that idea of like how information technology would interact with human decision making, I think there's a whole area there that's still very poorly understood. So I think we're getting better on the human element. We're getting better at systems thinking, but we're still integrating the information plus systems plus humans component. So I think there's a lot there for us to work out still.
Thank you so much for the time. How can people reach you? And is there any specific help you're looking for these days where you want people to reach out to you?
I am on Twitter, JTF, one of those 3-letter early day Twitter handles. And that's the easiest way for people to reach me. I'm also on LinkedIn and conversationaltransformation.com. And I am really interested from hearing from people. And I'm really interested when people find out that they have trouble making change where they are. I've, for many years, done a session with people where I would say, are you frustrated? It's probably your fault. And and the idea is that there's probably some contribution you're making, or you have more freedom and degrees of control than you might realize. So I'm interested in hearing from people, in part because I want to sort of disprove this and find those places where, help me find the place where change is really impossible, and where there's no chance for improvement. I'm interested in those. So people, frustrated learners who are willing to share their stories, I find those incredibly helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Gene.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Up next will be my interview of Scott Havens, formerly Director of Software Engineering at Jet.com and Walmart Labs, and then Head of Supply Chain Technology at Moda Operandi. He gave one of the most amazing DevOps Summit presentations, describing how he helped rebuild the entire inventory management system for Walmart, the world's largest company. He earned this right by the amazing work he did building the incredible systems that powered Jet.com that Walmart had acquired. It powered the inventory management, order management, transportation, available to promise, available to ship, and tons of other critical processes that all must go right for an online retailer. He talked about functional programming principles not in the small, but in the large, and how it enabled building and running one of the world's largest supply chain systems more safely, more quickly, and even more cheaply. This inspired one of my favorite story elements in the Unicorn Project. I know you'll enjoy it, and see you then. I hope you enjoyed that final episode of Season 1. While we take a break over the holidays, I want to share with you some of the great opportunities for you to continue your learning journey. First off, you should of course read Agile Conversations, the book that Jeffrey co-authored, and while you're at it, pick up a copy of John Smart's new book, Sooner, Safer, Happier. I love both books. And keep an eye on IT Revolution's Twitter account at ITRevBooks for lots of holiday giveaways. And don't forget to sign up for the IT Revolution newsletter at itrevolution.com for updates about the release of Season 2. See you then.